Yep, this show is finally over. After 6 long weeks of enduring this series, I can finally set my soul free. Now, obviously, the reaction for this is not really going to be positive because I just finished watching Dune Prophecy. And I'm just going to be very blunt about it. This show is really bad. Like, actually terrible. Now, it's a bit of a shame I have to really kind of label it as that because I really love Dune Part 1 and Part 2. In fact, Dune Part 2 is probably my film of the year of 2024. And so I had a lot of expectations that Dune Prophecy was going to be great. Like how they could set Frank Herbert's Dune universe and seeing how that all comes together. And also this show was also on the lead up to the conclusion of the Penguin series, which even I talked about the Penguin, and I thought the Penguin is an amazing show, like an absolute must-watch show. And from that lead up, I really had a lot of confidence that Dune Prophecy was gonna follow the same expectation from Dune Part One, Part Two, like those films, and also after conclusion of the Penguin. But no, instead of not concluding it from what HBO and Warner Brothers should have learned from, they went back down again and sunk to the deepest pits of hell to make this pile of trash. And it is rubbish. Like everything is just rubbish about this show. I really can't stress like anything about it. Like I really felt, annoyed with this show because I really love Dune Part 1, Part 2, and this show just doesn't really take anything from the writing, the storytelling, anything from those movies to this series, and it just lacks everything that I really would expect it from a series to be good. Yeah, let me just talk about like the few positives I have, because unfortunately throughout this whole video there's not gonna be any. So the only positives are this. I think the actors did try hard for what they were given. I'm gonna kind of give more details of that later because I think throughout the whole series it just falls apart. But also the series itself, I think visually and the production, it's amazing. Like actually really, really good. Like Dune Part 2 this year, you could tell like how the visuals and the production for a science fiction film really comes to life. And Dune Prophecy is actually no different. And I actually think those are like the real compliments I have for this series. But unfortunately that's really where it ends, because apart from those positives, everything else just falls apart massively. From the storytelling, the writing, the script, the pacing, and really any moments, there's nothing to draw upon from this show. Everything is just a disaster. So let's actually talk about the series itself. So Dune Prophecy is set 10,000 years before the events of the first part two of the Dune movies. And it follows around, essentially, from what I've grasped, two main characters. Valia and Tula Harkonnen, who are essentially part formation of the Sisterhood. Valia Harkonnen is known as Mother Superior. She is essentially is the leader of the whole Sisterhood, or the Harkonnens, I guess. And it's essentially the way that they try and format the Bene Gesserits. And they're like witches that have these sort of powers where they will, I wouldn't say whisper, but they have this sort of power of, controlling and manipulating things. So sometimes throughout this show, you would see mostly Valia, who is always going to go up to people and just betray anyone with her voice, is saying, "Get the knife out, cut his throat, stab yourself," or whatever. Like actually kind of speaking like is some sort of thing that you see from The Exorcist, from a horror movie of some kind. And it's just essentially witches, the best part I could say. It's centered around that, but it's also centered on the idea of power, essentially. And it also follows, the power of the Cornero bloodline as well. So you have Emperor Javeco Cornero, if I pronounce right, who's played by Mark Strong. He's essentially the emperor, and essentially he's kind of in this position of essentially losing power, or finding, someone else to replace his power in the bloodline. But all those components that they try and build up this show around, and especially its characters, is really terrible. Like, there's really no development for the characters or any progression within its story. Most of the time you watch this series, it's just constant vomit dialogue, just dialogue after dialogue with characters, and none of them get any development, or none of them are interesting at all. Like, apart from maybe you see Valia Harkonnen, the Mother Superior, there's also another character that kind of comes across as a bit of a interesting caveat, which is Desmond Hart, who is essentially this non-native Fremen who mostly has these like powers where he will just sit and stare at you, or just lingers around and somehow burns anyone into a fried crisp, essentially. But apart from those sort of things, there's no real sense that it becomes thrilling or a shock twist, because they don't develop the characters, the narrative at all around it, and everything just feels meaningless, or just for the sake of it, for whatever this show progressed itself with. And practically every show I watched that progressed is so boring. Like, that is also the other thing. It is such a boring series. And I really felt like every single time I just couldn't stay awake watching it. Like, even moments that I probably feel like I don't want to sleep, this show would make me want to fall asleep, because it can't deliver any moments that are interesting, make its characters interesting to get me hooked onto, or actually make me understand their motivations a little bit more. Nothing. It didn't attempt to do anything like that. And it also doesn't really have many moments as well. You could probably sit through this show and you would just wait for a moment or a twist to happen. And sometimes they do try and do that, but they do it in such a unorthodox way where it just happens out of nowhere. And it just leaves you feeling like, okay, like, who cares, or who gives a fuck, really? I mean, it's just honestly just atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. I can't stress, like, everything about this series is just, it's just so bad. Now, just to kind of finish off, I do think there are issues with this show. And certainly if you watch Dune Part 1 and Part 2, if you watch those movies into the lead up to this series, you will see that there is like a massive issue with it. Like, it's so disconnected. It's like everything that you perceive from watching the films to Dune Prophecy is just a complete mess. And I think the problem is because the Dune Prophecy was based on a book that wasn't influenced or written by Frank Herbert. It was actually written by his son Brian Herbert, and the movies that were separate were written by Frank Herbert. I really think there is that disconnect, probably due to the writing. I don't know for certain if that would have been the case, but I think because it was based on a different book that Brian Herbert wrote, it wasn't Frank Herbert, I think the way it was adapted could have been the reason maybe it wasn't always going to proceed very well. And I think based on that, I could kind of tell the difference, really. And I think you can't really take this show seriously for what it did compared to like the movies. And I think the writing and the way it was adapted really did feel like an effect on me watching it, because it was just so sobering, so boring, so lackluster. You just feel like just completely numb watching it. Like Dune Part 1 and Part 2, watching those films, it made you feel immersed, like actually like dumbfounded, like how great a film is. And then this series just falls apart, and you just list every single component that is just, pitiful about it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I do apologize if this may come across as a rant. I am actually kind of furious with this show because I was excited to watch it. I really, really wanted this show to do well because I really liked Dune Part 1, Part 2 a lot, and I had a lot of expectations for this show. But man, it is so disappointing. The recent thing I heard is that they are renewing this show for a second series. I don't know whether I really would want to watch it. I mean, begs belief whether I would or not, but man, this first season was hard to watch, hard to stay awake, and there was no room for any smile on my face. But yeah, if you have watched Dune Prophecy, let me know what you think of this show. Yeah, if you enjoyed the video or the rant, please like, comment, subscribe, dislike if you want to dislike, and yeah, that's about it. See you later.